My name is Natalie. I was 10 years old when my parents left me with $15 and no one by my side. They didn't argue. They didn't sit me down for a long talk. They acted like everything had already been decided, like this was just another item on a checklist they needed to get through before leaving. The money was placed in my hand quickly, almost casually, as if it solved the problem of food time and the fact that I was still a kid. There was no one scheduled to check on me, no note explaining what to do if something went wrong, no backup plan waiting on the counter. When the door closed behind them, the apartment didn't feel dramatic or frightening at first. It just felt quiet in a way I wasn't used to, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every thought you're trying not to have. At 10 years old, I didn't think about a whole month. I thought about the next few hours. I told myself that if they trusted me enough to leave, then staying calm was my responsibility. I counted the money once, folded it carefully, and put it away, like it was something important. I didn't call anyone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't tell myself this was dangerous. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself being quiet meant being mature. I told myself that handling things on my own was the right thing to do. What I didn't understand then was that silence can look a lot like control right up until the moment it collapses. 1 month later, when they came back, my father stepped into that same apartment, stopped cold, and stared at what he saw long enough to whisper, "No, no, this can't be happening." If you want to know how $15 and one quiet month turned into the moment everything broke, stay with me. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because some truths only surface when someone finally tells them out loud. It began with a decision that felt reasonable to a 10-year-old who believed being careful could solve most problems. I didn't spend the $15 all at once. I chose items that wouldn't spoil quickly and didn't require anything complicated, telling myself this was what planning looked like. I counted the bills more than once before handing them over, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to make sure I didn't make a mistake I couldn't undo. The moment I walked away, I understood something without fully putting it into words. There would be no second chance. Whatever I had left was all there was. Back in the apartment, I arranged everything with intention, spacing things out, so it wouldn't be obvious how little I actually had, because looking normal felt safer than explaining myself. I kept the same routine every day, waking up, eating at fixed times, turning lights on and off as if someone else was tracking it, because routine made the situation feel controlled. I learned quickly that attention was the real risk. When neighbors passed by, I smiled briefly and kept moving, careful not to stop long enough for questions. I stopped lingering in shared spaces, stopped sitting where someone might notice me alone, and started timing my movements so I blended into the background. One afternoon, a knock came at the door, light and unexpected, the kind that suggests someone isn't in a hurry. I froze, listening, holding my breath, waiting for footsteps to move on. They did, but the feeling stayed with me. After that, I avoided the door unless I absolutely had to leave, and when I did, I made sure I looked like I belonged somewhere else, backpack on, keys visible, like I was just another kid coming and going for reasons no one needed to question. I didn't tell anyone I was on my own. I didn't hint. I didn't test the truth to see how it would sound out loud. I focused instead on not causing problems, on not creating situations that required explanations, because explanations felt dangerous. Silence, I decided, was something I could manage. If I stayed quiet, if I handled things myself, then nothing would spiral out of control. Each day became an adjustment. Small changes made, carefully stretching what I had, avoiding anything that might draw attention, convincing myself that asking for help would only make everything harder. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I was trying to keep things steady. At 10 years old, I believed responsibility meant not adding weight to someone else's life, even if that meant carrying it alone. I didn't think of silence as a warning sign. I thought of it as proof that I was doing exactly what was expected of me. Over time, the changes stopped being something I noticed and became something I had to manage. I didn't wake up feeling sick or weak, but I woke up tired in a way that didn't make sense, like my body was already behind before the day even started. Simple movements took more effort, and I learned to pace myself so I wouldn't look different from anyone else. My schedule slowly drifted without me choosing at meals, no longer lined up with the clock. Sleep came in uneven stretches, and I stopped being sure whether it was early or late unless I checked. I adjusted everything around what would draw the least attention because being questioned felt more dangerous than being uncomfortable. I avoided places where adults tended to linger, timed my movements, so I blended in with other kids coming and going and left early whenever there was a chance I'd be asked to stay. I wasn't hiding because I felt guilty, I was hiding because explanations required details, and details could unravel things faster than silence. That was when I started writing things down, not because I was upset, but because my days were beginning to blur together. I didn't trust my memory the way I used to, so I recorded small facts that felt unimportant at the time: when I left, when I came back, when I ate, when I tried to sleep, patterns that gave shape to days that otherwise slipped past without clear edges. Writing wasn't emotional, it was practical. A way to keep track of myself when no one else was doing it. As the days passed, ordinary situations began exposing how fragile my routine really was. Papers appeared that needed an adult's signature, and I paused too long before folding them away already, knowing I couldn't fill them out properly. Emergency contact sections stayed blank, and I learned how to hold forms at angles so no one would see what was missing. Time itself became another problem. Arriving too early made people look twice. Arriving late raised different questions. I aimed for the middle, always the middle, choosing times that didn't stand out, even if it meant waiting longer than I should have, or leaving before I was ready. I memorized phone numbers I thought might matter, even though I wasn't sure who would answer if I used them, and I kept my phone close while avoiding it at the same time, because unanswered messages felt heavier than not sending any at all. My body kept adapting, but it wasn't improving. Rest didn't fully reset me. Hunger felt dull rather than sharp, and my energy flattened into something I could ration, but not restore. I told myself this was manageable, that managing was the same as being okay, but the effort it took to keep everything balanced kept increasing. Every day required calculation, every interaction required forethought, and every small mistake carried more weight than it should have. The notes I was keeping no longer looked like reminders, they looked like records, and that realization stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I began to understand quietly and without panic that this wasn't a situation designed to continue. It depended on too many adjustments, too much awareness, too much restraint from someone my age. I wasn't falling apart, but I wasn't stable either. I was maintaining something that only worked as long as no one looked too closely, and for the first time, I could see that eventually someone would. It didn't happen because of one mistake or one obvious sign. It happened because patterns don't stay hidden forever. Cynthia Ward noticed me the way adults do when something feels slightly off, but not urgent enough to name yet. She saw how I moved through the day with too much precision, how I arrived and left at nearly identical times, how I never waited around or lingered after things ended. She noticed that I adjusted quickly when plans changed, that I always seemed ready to leave before anyone suggested it, and that I avoided situations where casual questions tended to come up. She didn't comment on any of it, at first, didn't pull me aside or ask what was wrong. She simply watched and let the repetitions stack up on their own. When she spoke to me for the first time, it wasn't framed as concern. Just a simple remark delivered in passing, asking if everything was okay at home. The question was calm, almost routine, and when I didn't answer right away, she didn't fill the silence or push for one. That space made it clear she wasn't fishing for a story. I didn't explain myself or offer details. I said only what was necessary, that things were fine, and that I was handling it, keeping my voice even because anything more felt like it might invite follow-up. Cynthia nodded once and moved on, not because she believed me, but because she understood what my answer was meant to do. After that, she didn't single me out or change how she treated me, but she paid closer attention, noting the same behaviors repeating: the way I declined anything that involved staying later than planned, the way I avoided paperwork and conversations that required information I couldn't give. She never corrected me or called attention to what she saw, and that restraint made her presence heavier than if she had reacted strongly. The next time she spoke to me, it was in a moment that felt deliberately ordinary, her tone unchanged, asking whether there was someone she could contact if there was ever an emergency. I answered honestly without expanding on it, saying there wasn't anyone available right now. It wasn't an emotional confession or a dramatic reveal, just a statement of fact delivered as plainly as possible. Cynthia didn't ask why or request names. She didn't raise her voice or alert anyone else. She accepted the answer and filed it away. Over the following days, she found small reasons to stay nearby without hovering, not watching me directly, but close enough to see how carefully I navigated interactions, how quickly I adapted when something unexpected came up, how consistently I avoided situations that might require explanation. She never asked about my parents or where they were. She didn't test me with follow-up questions. She waited, allowing the pattern to speak for itself. When she finally addressed it again, it wasn't as an accusation or a demand, just an offer made quietly, saying that if I ever needed help with phone calls or forms, she was available. I didn't promise anything or ask for clarification. I simply acknowledged it because accepting the offer felt safer than rejecting it outright. Cynthia didn't escalate the situation or treat it like a crisis, but she also didn't let it disappear into politeness. She continued observing, documenting in her own way, without turning me into a problem that needed to be solved publicly. For the first time since being on my own, I could feel the presence of someone who was paying attention without forcing a response, someone who didn't need me to explain or break down to recognize that something wasn't lining up. That awareness shifted the balance around me, not abruptly, but enough to make it clear that staying invisible was no longer entirely in my control, and that the space I'd been using to quietly manage everything was starting to narrow, whether I acknowledged it or not. The shift was subtle, but once it started, it didn't stop. Paul Turner entered quietly, not as someone there to confront or fix anything, but as someone whose job was to arrange what already existed into something that could be understood without emotion. He didn't ask me to explain myself or tell my story. Again, he asked for what I had written, then spread the pages out and began placing them in order. Dates came first, then times, then locations. Not to dramatize them, but to see how they lined up when placed side by side. Paul moved slowly and deliberately, asking short questions that clarified sequence, rather than meaning questions that didn't imply blame or sympathy. As the notes were aligned, what had felt like separate days began forming a continuous line, one that showed gaps where supervision should have been, and overlaps where assumptions had filled in for reality. Paul didn't comment on that either. He simply adjusted the layout until the timeline could be followed without explanation. Next came messages, brief and functional, checked not for tone, but for frequency and timing. They were short texts sent from a distance, reminders without follow-up instructions, without confirmation. One message mentioned locking the door. Another asked if I had eaten. None of them required a response, and none of them checked whether what was suggested had actually happened. Paul recorded the timestamps and placed them alongside everything else, letting the pattern speak without adding interpretation. In that arrangement, James Cooper's role became clear without being named as anything specific. He hadn't vanished or cut off contact. He hadn't ignored me completely. He had trusted that what was in place was enough, that occasional messages counted as oversight, that the structure left behind would hold. Paul didn't say whether that trust was reasonable or misplaced. He didn't frame it as neglect or care. It sat there neutrally, part of the record, aligned with everything else. Decisions followed the same quiet logic. I was moved somewhere else temporarily, not because anyone declared an emergency, but because the timeline showed that staying where I was created unnecessary risk while details were still being reviewed. The move was handled without explanation that made it feel dramatic, and without language that suggested punishment or rescue. My parents were not contacted. There were no calls asking for clarification or reassurance. Paul explained the process in plain terms, focusing on accuracy and documentation, making it clear that the goal was to understand the situation fully before reacting to it. That restraint made everything feel more serious than anger would have. Days passed without confrontation, and the absence of immediate response became its own statement. There were no apologies, no demands, no attempts to reset the situation before it had been named. The file continued to grow, not through accusations but through ordinary details that required no interpretation to matter. My role changed without announcement. I stopped managing every variable and started letting others handle the structure I had been trying to maintain on my own. The quiet of it all left space for questions that no one answered out loud. Some would look at the record and see a father who stayed connected enough to believe things were handled. Others would see distance disguised as responsibility. That division wasn't resolved, and it didn't need to be. It was left exactly where it belonged between intention and outcome while the rest of the record settled into place, complete enough to stand on its own without anyone needing to raise their voice or explain what it meant. It was supposed to be ordinary, the kind of return that assumes nothing changed while you were gone. The car stopped, the engine went quiet, and James Cooper stepped out first, reaching for his keys with the relaxed certainty of someone coming back to a space he believed he understood. He unlocked the door and went in alone. No one followed him. No voices answered his presence. The apartment didn't greet him with chaos or neglect, just an unnatural calm that took a few seconds to register. He set his bag down and stood still, waiting for the familiarity to settle in, but it didn't. The quiet wasn't empty. It was careful, the kind that comes from habits designed not to be noticed. James walked farther inside, his attention caught by small details that didn't belong to a normal absence. The mail was stacked, not scattered untouched, but sorted. A chair was angled away from the table as if someone had learned to sit without leaving marks. The lights were off where they should have been on where they should have been off. Choices made deliberately, rather than carelessly. None of it screamed trouble, but none of it matched the picture he had carried with him. He reached the kitchen counter and stopped. Papers were laid out there in a straight line, aligned too precisely to be accidental. He didn't touch them. He didn't need to. Dates and times were visible at a glance, written in a steady hand, evenly spaced, not emotional, not rushed. It wasn't a list. It was a record. The sight slowed his breathing without him noticing. He looked around again, this time not expecting the room to reassure him, but to explain itself. The refrigerator hummed when he opened it, and what he saw inside made no sense in the context of how long he had been gone. Not empty, not stocked, just measured as if someone had been counting instead of shopping. He closed the door carefully, the sound too loud in the quiet, and his eyes returned to the papers. This wasn't the result of a bad day or a missed detail. It was the result of sustained effort. That realization landed heavily because effort meant awareness, and awareness meant endurance. James pulled out his phone without thinking and scrolled through the messages he had sent while away. Short check-ins, generic reminders, words he had believed were enough because they suggested presence. Seeing them now, stripped of intention and placed against the evidence in front of him, they felt thin. They assumed stability without confirming it. He took a step back and noticed a bag by the door, not packed for travel, not abandoned, just set aside as if waiting for permission to be moved. The apartment didn't feel lived in by chance. It felt managed. The quiet pressed in, not accusing, not dramatic, just undeniable. James's mouth opened before he decided to speak the words, coming out low and uneven. No, no, this can't be happening. Saying it didn't change anything. The papers stayed where they were. The bag didn't move. The room didn't offer an explanation. He lowered himself into a chair slowly, not because he was exhausted, but because standing felt like pretending he still had control. In that position, the full picture settled in. This wasn't a single oversight waiting to be corrected with an apology or a phone call. It was a sequence that had unfolded without him, supported by assumptions he had never tested. The apartment wasn't waiting for him to fix it. It was showing him what had already been carried out quietly, patiently, and far beyond the point where belief could undo it. In that moment, James understood that whatever he thought he had arranged, whatever structure he believed was holding in his absence, had existed mostly in theory. The reality was already complete, and it didn't need his permission to be real. There was no moment where I prepared a speech or decided what to say, because by the time I stood in that space again, words were already unnecessary. James Cooper looked at me as if he expected clarification, something verbal that could reframe what he had seen, but nothing in the room required my explanation anymore. I didn't argue with him or correct the assumptions he was still trying to adjust. I didn't point to the records or remind him how they came to exist. Everything that mattered had already been established without my participation. He spoke carefully, not loudly, not defensively, choosing his words like someone hoping precision might repair distance, but his tone stayed centered on intention rather than consequence. I listened without reacting, not because I was unsure, but because I no longer needed to respond to be understood. Silence wasn't a tactic now. It was simply the absence of unfinished business. Ryan Cooper arrived without urgency or commentary, not positioned as a rescuer or an alternative authority, just present as another option that didn't demand justification. He didn't ask what I wanted to do or wait for permission to speak. He stood slightly apart and let the situation remain exactly what it was, unresolved in the way that made resolution unnecessary. I picked up my bag without looking around the apartment because there was nothing left there that required acknowledgement. The decision wasn't formed in that moment. It had been assembled quietly through accumulation, through choices made earlier that didn't need to announce themselves to be final. James watched me as if he expected hesitation, a pause that might reopen the exchange, but none came. I adjusted the strap, checked nothing, and moved toward the door. No one stepped in front of me. No one tried to stop what was already in motion. That lack of resistance confirmed what words couldn't, that the authority James believed he still held had already dissolved, not through confrontation, but through neglect. I didn't explain where I was going, or what this meant going forward. I didn't frame the moment as separation or punishment. I walked past him because the role he occupied no longer defined my position. The hallway didn't feel symbolic or heavy. It felt neutral, like a space meant to be passed through rather than remembered. Ryan opened the car door without rushing or signaling relief, treating the moment as procedural rather than emotional, and I got in without looking back. The bag rested easily beside me, lighter than it should have felt, not because it held less, but because it no longer carried responsibility that wasn't mine. Through the window, I saw James standing still in the doorway, not calling out, not following, watching something end, without having the ability to delay it. The car pulled away smoothly. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to confirm anything visually to know the separation was complete. The apartment receded without significance, not as a loss or a rejection, but as a location that had finished serving its purpose. There was no final message delivered, no lesson offered, no reconciliation staged for closure. My parents lost the right to remain present, not because of one absence, but because of a pattern they trusted to sustain itself without oversight. That consequence didn't require my explanation or approval to be real. As the distance widened, the silence inside the car felt different from before. It wasn't the controlled quiet of endurance or caution. It was the stillness that follows a decision already carried out. I faced forward and stayed there not because I was running from the past, but because there was nothing behind me that still required my attention. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.